the Second Industrial Revolution and its impact. Lecture terms. The Second Industrial Revolution. Focus question. What factors combined to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War? The industrial economy. In the late 19th century, the United States experienced perhaps the fastest and most far-reaching economic revolution in history. Abundant natural resources, a growing labor supply and market for manufactured goods, as well as new capital for investment, all fostered massive economic expansion. The federal government also spurred industrial and agricultural development by enacting tariffs, protecting U.S. industry from foreign competition, also giving land to railroads, and using the Army to remove Indians or Native Americans from Western lands wanted by farmers and mining companies. Every region except the South saw a rapid expansion of manufacturing, mining, and railroad construction. This all ended an earlier American-based, small farming type country that also had artisan workshops. By 1913, the United States produced about a third of the world's entire industrial output. Half of all industrial workers labored in plants with more than 250 employees. By 1890, 2/3 of Americans worked for wages, making dreams of economic independence, like owning a farm or workshop, unattainable for most. Times were changing. Between 1870 and 1920, a new working class developed with about 11 million Americans moving from farm to city and 25 million immigrating from overseas. Most new jobs were in industrial cities, whose rapid growth was best symbolized by New York, a city whose banks and stock exchange financed railroads, also financed mines and factories, and also sponsoring industrialization and westward expansion overall throughout the country. The Great Lakes region was the center of industrialization also, with iron, steel, machinery, chemicals, and food production in large cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago, and countless smaller cities. Railroads enabled the Second Industrial Revolution. Private investment and huge grants of land and money by federal, state, and local governments tripled the number of miles of rail between 1860, before the Civil War, and 1880. And it tripled again over the next 40 years after that. This opened vast new areas to commercial farming and created a national market for manufactured goods. By the 1890s, 5 transcontinental railroad lines carried Western mine, farm, ranch, and forest products to markets in the East, which in turn made factory goods that would be shipped to the West. Railroads were so critical to economic growth and the national market that financial crises in the rail industry directly shocked the entire national economy. An expanding population became an ever larger market for mass production. Also, mass distribution and mass marketing of goods were possible. All of these were the basis of a modern industrial economy. National brands, national stores, and mail-order firms such as Sears and Roebuck emerged for the first time. The Second Industrial Revolution. Extraordinary technological innovations helped quicken communications and economic expansion. Telegraph lines crossed the Atlantic to Europe, and the telephone, the typewriter, and handheld cameras began to be used in the 1870s and 1880s. Thomas A. Edison's inventions, such as the phonograph, the light bulb, and motion pictures, all revolutionized private life, public entertainment, and economic activity. Edison also created systems for distributing electric power, and soon entire cities had electricity for homes, factories, and streetcars. Electricity enabled industrial and urban growth by providing a more dependable and useful source of power than water or steam. The newly invented electric motor harnessed the power of this innovation for industry and for households. Just think what our world would be like today without electricity. Economic growth was remarkable, but quite volatile. With markets inundated by goods and federal monetary policies that removed money from the national economy and reduced prices, a series of severe economic recessions and depressions occurred, most notably in the 1870s and the 1890s. Businesses competed ruthlessly during this time period. To stabilize prices and profits, railroads and other companies formed, quote, pools to divide markets and fix prices, and, quote, trusts that allowed a single director to manage the affairs of several competing companies. But the drive to compete often quickly disintegrated such schemes. Competition led some firms to control their entire industry by buying out the competition. Economic concentration ultimately will culminate in the Great Merger Wave from 1897 to 1904, in which about 4,000 companies were incorporated into larger corporations that served national markets and thus wielded immense power. Giant corporations appeared, such as Standard Oil, International Harvester, and U.S. Steel, which was formed in 1901 by financier J.P. Morgan out of 8 large steel firms. Eventually, Andrew Carnegie would come on the scene. Big corporations, also known as big business. With no personal or corporate income taxes to speak of, some businessmen accumulated massive wealth and economic power. Can you imagine no personal or corporate income taxes today? One such, quote, captain of industry was the aforementioned Andrew Carnegie, who immigrated to the United States from Scotland as a teenager and labored as a factory worker and a telegraph operator before he used a position with the Pennsylvania Railroad to build a steel empire. During the 1870s Depression, Carnegie built a, quote, vertically integrated steel company, one that controlled every stage of production, from raw materials to transportation, manufacturing, and distribution. Because he controlled all of the parts and all of the stages of production, he maintained all the profits. By the 1890s, Carnegie dominated the steel industry by doing this, and he amassed a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars. His steel factories at Homestead, Pennsylvania, were the most technologically advanced in the world. Although Carnegie's upbringing instilled him to have a commitment to democracy, social equality, and charity, he ran his factories quite ruthlessly. More associated with extraordinary wealth was John D. Rockefeller, who rose from being a merchant clerk to an oil industry titan. Through cutthroat competition, he ruined rival oil companies, arranged deals with railroads, and fixed prices on production. This way he could undercut his competition and force them to sell their industries to him. He mastered what was known as horizontal integration, in which one firm acquires competing firms, but soon he established a vertically integrated company, a monopoly that controlled the drilling, refining, storage, and distribution of oil, much like Carnegie had done with steel. By the 1880s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of America's oil industry. Such figures, like Carnegie and Rockefeller, with their wealth, attracted the admiration and the resentment of many Americans. While many rose from modest circumstances, their wealth and their methods of treating workers and conducting business alienated many Americans who thought their unregulated actions eroded political and economic freedom and damaged democracy. In the book Wealth Against Commonwealth, written in 1894, this was an expose of Standard Oil's manipulation of markets and bribery of legislatures. The author Henry Lloyd wrote that, quote, "Liberty and monopoly cannot live together," end quote. So what of workers and freedom in the industrial age? The benefits of economic expansion during this second industrial revolution were distributed highly unevenly. For a few workers, including skilled workers with some control over production processes, people like miners and iron and steel workers, high wages were the norm. Most industrial workers, however, had semi-skilled jobs that required only managing a machine. These workers had no control over production and were easily replaced and dismissed during a strike or economic downturn. Regular and prolonged unemployment became widespread for these workers, some of whom became tramps and vagabonds, taking to the roads and the railways to search for employment. Though American workers earned more than their European counterparts, work was more dangerous in the United States than in Europe. And because of the high unemployment and use of public and private police, most strikes in America failed. Many workers were extremely poor and relied on family to survive. Class divisions became more visible in this period as more Americans became middle class and very wealthy. The rich began to retreat to their own neighborhoods and built fantastic mansions and estates in the cities and in the countryside. A growing number of urban middle-class professionals, office workers, and small businessmen moved to urban and suburban neighborhoods and used new streetcars and commuter railways to get to central business districts. By 1890, the richest 1% of Americans received the same total income as the bottom half of the population. They also owned more property than the remaining 99% of the population. Many wealthy Americans conspicuously consumed an aristocratic lifestyle of luxury goods, including attending exclusive clubs, paying for very expensive colleges, and attending very extravagant social events. Not far from the homes of the wealthy were the slums of the urban poor. The difference between the two worlds was captured in Matthew Smith's 1868 bestseller, Sunshine and Shadow in New York, which began with an engraving contrasting a $2 million mansion with the slums that were not too far away from it. 2 decades after that, Jacob Riis published a book of photographs called How the Other Half Lives. This book documented the poor's wretched existence in New York City. It showed illness and alcoholism were running rampant in these workers' neighborhoods. It showed the depravity in which they were living, in contrast to the extravagance of those who employed them. The transformation of the West. Focus question: how was the West transformed economically and socially in this period? Western transformation. Capitalism advanced most quickly and dramatically in the Trans-Mississippi West, whose lands now became absorbed by white settlement and whose resources became available for exploitation. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. In this lecture, he argued that the frontier had forged America's culture, distinctive qualities such as individual freedom, political democracy, and economic mobility. Turner argued that the frontier land had been a safety valve, which drew away the dissatisfied in the East and therefore mitigated social unrest. Perhaps that's why many of the labor unions, when they did strikes in the East, were not very successful, and the big businessmen were able to maintain their stranglehold on the economy. Turner was very influential at the time, and he drew on long-standing notions that the West offered economic opportunity and freedom to newcomers. This would prompt many farmers and gold rush miners and immigrants that did not find economic opportunity elsewhere to go to the West. Migrants to the West moved in groups, usually families, not as individuals. The West was not an empty space, however. It was rather inhabited by Native American populations, who had to be displaced by the whites for the frontier to be settled. The West was also not a paradise of small farms, but an area with industrial mining and agriculture, as well as landlords and railroads. The West was also not a single area, but rather it was incredibly diverse, ranging from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains, the desert Southwest, and the verdant coasts and valleys of California and the Pacific Northwest. The incorporation of the West into the United States required the federal government's intervention. The government acquired Indian land by purchase or force. The government regulated territories, and the government gave land and money to farmers and railroads and mining companies. So despite the myth of the West's rugged individualism, the area became part of the nation only by massive government activity. Farming in the Trans-Mississippi West also meant that more land came into cultivation in the 30 years after the Civil War than in the previous 2.5 centuries of American history. Settlers acquired farmlands through the Homestead Act, and more bought land from speculators and railroad companies that had been given public lands by the federal government. A vast agricultural belt growing wheat and corn for national and international markets emerged in these areas known as the Middle Border: Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas. The Middle Border's arid land required irrigation and thus made family farming difficult. This meant that there would be the emergence of large bonanza farms over time. Bonanza farms had thousands of acres with many agricultural wage workers farming instead of families farming. These farms increasingly grew for national and international markets and specialized in one particular crop. Railroads brought factory goods to rural farmers who became more dependent on banks for loans, for machinery, and products were also very subject to the ups and downs of international agricultural prices. In other words, foodstuffs were becoming an international industry, and thus American farms became more part of a world market, in which farmers across the globe faced ongoing crises as competition increased and prices of foodstuffs declined. Eventually, the decades after the Civil War also saw the golden age of cattle ranching and cowboys. Railroad stations at Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, Kansas became destinations for now legendary cattle drives from Texas. The cowboys who worked the drives were a diverse group themselves, some white, some Mexican, and some black men. The cowboys became icons of freedom and were immortalized in fiction and film in later years. But their life was far from romantic. They were mostly low-paid wage workers, and the long-distance cattle drives ended by the 1880s, when farmers started fencing in lands with barbed wire, and severe winters killed millions of cattle. The cattle industry that reappeared eventually was dominated by large ranches close to the railroads. The West was also urban in some areas, with large cities such as San Francisco, and the growth of other cities like Los Angeles due to oil. Large corporate enterprises dominated the West, and particularly in industries such as lumber and mining and sheep farming in New Mexico. Independent owners and operators eventually gave way to large corporate firms, even in the West. Conflict on the Mormon frontier. In the 1840s, before the Civil War, the Mormons moved to the Salt Lake City area of the U.S. territory, now the capital of modern-day Utah. In 1857, after reports that the Utah Territory's appointed governor, the Mormon leader Brigham Young, was interfering with federal judges in the area, President James Buchanan removed Brigham Young and appointed a non-Mormon as governor there. Young refused to comply, and federal troops were sent to occupy the territory, and they remained there until the beginning of the Civil War. This started conflict in the area. Conflict between Mormons and non-Mormons continued in the region, and during this period, the Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred, in which a group of Mormons attacked a group of non-Mormons traveling by wagon to settle in California. All adults and older children were killed, over 100 people, with only a few small children surviving. More than 2 decades later, one of the leaders of the raid was tried and sentenced for murder. Over the next few decades, tensions continued as Mormon communities moved to other areas of the American West, but much of the conflicts were similar to those with non-Mormon U.S. settlers to the region. For example, Mormons saw the freewheeling lifestyles of the cowboys as the embodiment of immorality. In the 1880s, the Mormon leaders sought to keep from further antagonizing the U.S. government, though, and they did this by banning the long practice of polygamy in their religion. And they wrote the ban into Utah's state constitution upon its gaining statehood in 1896. conflict with Native Americans. As I mentioned before, the occupation of the West by settlers ultimately displaced the Native Americans who had been living there for many, many generations. The West's incorporation into the American economy sealed the doom of the Plains Indians and their world. Their lives had already been changed by the horse, and Indian migrants to the West helped form the 19th century's great tribes: the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Crow, the Kiowa, and the Sioux. Incessant warfare engulfed the tribes and newcomers. Most whites moving to the Pacific coast experienced little hostility from the Plains Indians, but the settlement of lands there beginning in the 1850s brought bloody conflict. Although President Grant declared a, quote, peace policy in 1869, warfare soon resumed. Civil War generals like Philip Sheridan attacked the basis of the Indian economy, destroying villages, horses, and the buffalo to end Indian or Native American resistance. By the 1880s, army campaigns and buffalo hunters had nearly eradicated the buffalo in the West. They were almost completely extinct by the 1880s. And that was the main staple food, meat, the protein source, for the Native American population. The Army subjugated one tribe after another. In 1877, U.S. troops under O.O. Howard, the former commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau that we mentioned in an earlier lecture, forced the Nez Perce Indians to surrender and relocate from Oregon to an Oklahoma reservation. 2 years later, Chief Joseph, that tribe's leader, delivered a speech in Washington to President Rutherford B. Hayes and other dignitaries that protested the reservation policy and used the language of freedom, strengthened by the Civil War and Reconstruction. He said, quote, "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself." Sounds very much like our own Constitution. Indians sometimes inflicted great costs on American forces as well, most notably in the year of 1876 at a battle at Little Bighorn, where the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, chiefs both, killed General George A. Custer and 250 of his U.S. soldiers. In the Southwest, the Apache leaders, Cochise and Geronimo, attacked white settlers and resisted Army units well into the 1880s, when they finally were forced to surrender. The Comanche, who had dominated other Indians or other Native Americans in New Mexico and Colorado, also fell to American power in the 1870s. This resistance only temporarily delayed the advance of white soldiers, settlers, and miners. Between the end of the Civil War and 1890, 8 new western states joined the Union. They were Nebraska, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. The Indians, or Native Americans, were removed from these areas to reservations throughout the West, where they lived in poverty and were taken advantage of by traders and government agents. The primary location of a majority of these reservations was in Oklahoma. Remaking Native American life. The Indians' idea of freedom, resting on preserving their cultural and political autonomy, and their control of their ancestral lands clashed with the values and interests of most white Americans. Nearly all believed that the federal government should persuade or force the Plains Indians to give up their land, religion, their communal property, their nomadic way of life, and adopt Christianity, and adopt the concept of private property and small farming on reservations, where men would work in the fields and women would work in the home. It's the American way, after all. In 1871, Congress ended the treaty system that had been established earlier on, in which the government had negotiated agreements whereby these Native American tribes were regarded as independent nations. That will all go by the wayside, and instead the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established. And they would erect schools on these reservations where Native American children would be removed from their parents and tribes and forced into these boarding schools where they were given new names and educated in white ways. In 1887, the Dawes Act was passed. The Dawes Act fragmented the lands of nearly all the tribes into small parcels to be given to the native families, with the rest of the land to be sold to white buyers. The Native Americans who accepted the farms and, quote, adopted the habits of civilized life, end quote, would be offered American citizenship. Though the policy led to the loss of much tribal land and the erosion of Native American cultural traditions, whites benefited enormously, taking much of the best Indian lands, including much of Oklahoma that had been set aside as reservation territory earlier on. In the 50 years after the Dawes Act's passage, Native Americans lost 86 million of the 138 million acres they had possessed in 1887. While many 19th century laws and treaties offered natives the right to become citizens, few of them accepted this offer, as most natives wanted to retain their tribal identity. Western courts, including our own Supreme Court, ruled that the 14th and 15th Amendments did not apply to Native Americans. In the late 1880s, some natives practiced the ghost dance, which was a religious movement to revitalize Indian life. Ghost dance leaders predicted that one day whites would disappear, the buffalo would return, and the Native American populations would resume their cultural practices, free from the ills introduced by white men in the United States. Large numbers of Native Americans gathered for singing, dancing, and religious ceremonies during these gatherings. When the government, fearing a revolt, sent troops to the reservations, soldiers opened fire on ghost dancers at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, killing as many as 200 Native Americans, mostly women and children. The massacre at Wounded Knee ended 4 centuries of armed conflict between Native Americans and European settlers and their descendants. By 1900, the native population had reached a nadir of 250,000. But the natives survived, and their numbers would eventually start to grow back during the 20th century. By 1900, about 53,000 natives had become citizens by accepting land allotments and adopting and adapting to the American way of life. Most natives would not be granted citizenship until 1919, after they served in the armed forces in World War I, or in 1924, when Congress made all Native Americans citizens. finally. The conquest of the West was part of a worldwide phenomenon in which settlers moved into the interior regions in temperate climates all over the globe, bringing familiar crops and livestock, and starting mining and other industries. Even other places outside the U.S., Argentina, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all of these areas, like the United States, are often called settler societies because immigrants from overseas rapidly will outnumber and displace the original inhabitants. Unlike in India and much of colonial Africa, where only a few Europeans managed to dominate entire societies.